221. I was deep in one of those daydreams which overtake even the shallowest of men, in the midst of the most tumultuous parties. Midnight had just sounded from the clock of the Élysée Bourbon. Seated in a window recess and hidden behind the sinuous folds of a silk curtain, I could contemplate at my leisure the garden of the mansion where I was spending the evening. The trees, partially covered with snow, stood out dimly against the grayish background of a cloudy sky, barely whitened by the moon. Seen amid these fantastic surroundings, they vaguely resembled ghosts half out of their shrouds, a gigantic representation of the famous Dance of the Dead. Then, turning in the other direction, I could admire the Dance of the Living. A splendid salon decorated in silver and gold, with glittering chandeliers, sparkling with candles. There, milling about, whirling around, flitting here and there, were the most beautiful women of Paris, the richest, the noblest, dazzling, stately, resplendent with diamonds, flowers in their hair, on their bosoms, on their heads, strewn over dresses or in garlands at their feet. Light, rustling movements, voluptuous steps, made the laces, the silk brocades, the gauzes, float around their delicate forms. Here and there, some overly animated glances darted forth, eclipsing the lights. The 222. Fire of the diamonds, and stimulated anew some too ardent heart. One might also catch movements of the head meaningful to lovers, and negative gestures for husbands. The sudden outbursts of the gamblers' voices at each unexpected turn of the dice, the clink of gold, mingled with the music and the murmur of conversation, and to complete the giddiness of this mass of people intoxicated by everything seductive the world can hold, a haze of perfume and general inebriation played upon the fevered mind. Thus, on my right, the dark and silent image of death, on my left, the seemly bacchanalias of life, here, cold nature, dull, in mourning, there, human beings enjoying themselves. On the borderline between these two so different scenes, which, 1,000 times repeated in various guises, make Paris the world's most amusing and most philosophical city, I was making for myself a moral Macédoine, half pleasant, half funereal. With my left foot I beat time, and I felt as though the other were in the grave. My leg was in fact chilled by one of those insidious draughts which freeze half our bodies while the other half feels the humid heat of rooms, an occurrence rather frequent at balls. Monsieur de Lanty hasn't owned this house for very long, has he? Oh yes. Marechal Carigliano sold it to him nearly 10 years ago. Ah! These people must have huge fortune. They must have. What a party! It's shockingly elegant. Do you think they're as rich as M. de Nucingen or M. de Gondreville? You mean you don't know? I stuck my head out and recognized the two speakers as members of that strange race which, in Paris, deals exclusively with whys and hows, with where did they come from? What's happening? What has she done? They lowered their voices and walked off to talk in greater comfort on some isolated sofa. Never had a richer vein been offered to seekers after mystery. Nobody knew what country the Lanty family came from, or from what business. 223. What plunder, what piratical activity, or what inheritance derived a fortune estimated at several millions. All the members of the family spoke Italian, French, Spanish, English, and German perfectly enough to create the belief that they must have spent a long time among these various peoples. Were they Bipsies? Were they freebooters? Even if it's the devil, some young politicians said, they give a marvelous arty dot. Even if the Count de Lanty had robbed a bank, I'd marry his daughter any time. Cried a philosopher who wouldn't have married Marianina, a girl of 16 whose beauty embodied the fabled imaginings of the Eastern poets. Like the Sultan's daughter, in the story of the magic lamp, she should have been kept veiled. Her singing put into the shade the partial talents of Malibran, Sontag, and Fodor, in whom one dominant quality has always excluded over all perfection, whereas Marianina was able to bring to the same level purity of sound, sensibility, rightness of movement and pitch, soul and science, correctness and feeling. This girl was the embodiment of that secret poetry, the common bond among all the arts, which always eludes those who search for it. Sweet and modest, educated and witty, no one could eclipse Marianina, save her mother. Have you ever encountered one of those women whose striking beauty defies the inroads of age and who seem at 36 more desirable than they could have been 15 years earlier? Their visage is a vibrant soul, it glows, each feature sparkles with intelligence, each pore has a special brilliance, especially in artificial light. Their seductive eyes refuse, attract, speak, or remain silent, their walk is innocently knowledgeable, their voices employ the melodious wealth of the most coquettishly soft and tender notes. Based on comparisons, their praises flatter the self-love of the most sentient. A movement of their eyebrows, the least glance, their pursed lips, fill with a kind of terror those whose life and happiness depend on them. Inexperienced in love and influenced by words, a young girl can be seduced. For this kind of woman, however, a man must know, like M.D. Jacquard, not to cry out when he is hiding in a closet and the maid breaks two of his fingers as she shuts the 224 door on them. In loving these powerful sirens, one gambles with ohm's hive, and this, perhaps, is why we love them so passionately. Such was the Countess de Lanty. Filippo, Marianina's brother, shared with his sister in the Countess's marvelous beauty. To be brief, this young man was a living image of Antinous, even more slender. Yet how well these thin, delicate proportions are suited to young people when an olive complexion, strongly defined eyebrows, and the fire of velvet eyes give promise of future male passion. Of Brethauteli Filippo resided in every girl's heart as an ideal, he also resided in the memory of every mother as the best catch in France. The beauty, the fortune, the wit, the charms of these two children, came solely from their mother. The Count de Lanty was small, ugly, and pock-marked, dark as a Spaniard, dull as a banker. However, he was taken to be a deep politician, perhaps because he rarely laughed, and was always quoting Metternich or Wellington. This mysterious family had all the appeal of one of Lord Byron's poems, whose difficulties each person in the fashionable world interpreted in a different way, an obscure and sublime song in every strophe. The reserve maintained by M. and Madame de Lanty about their origin, their past life, and their relationship with the four corners of the globe had not lasted long as a subject of astonishment in Paris. Nowhere perhaps is Vespasian's axiom better understood. There, even blood-stained or filthy money betrays nothing and stands for everything. So long as high society knows the amount of your fortune, you are classed among those having an equal amount, and no one asks to see your family tree, because everyone knows how much it cost. In a city where social problems are solved like algebraic equations, adventurers have every opportunity in their favor. Even supposing this family were of gypsy origin, it was so wealthy, so attractive, that society had no trouble in forgiving its little secrets. Unfortunately, however, the mystery of the Lantys presented a continuing source of curiosity, rather like that contained in the novels of Anne Radcliffe. Observers, people who make it a point to know in what shop you buy your candlesticks, or who ask the amount of your rent when they find your apartment attractive, had noticed, now and 225. Then, in the midst of the Countess's parties, concerts, balls, and routs, the appearance of a strange personage. It was a man. The first time he had appeared in the mansion was during a concert, when he seemed to have been drawn to the salon by Marianine's enchanting voice. All of a sudden, "I'm cold," a lady had said who was standing with a friend by the door. The stranger, who was standing next to the women, went away. "That's odd, I'm warm now," she said, after the stranger had gone. "And you'll say I'm mad, but I can't help thinking that my neighbor, the man dressed in black who just left, was the cause of my chill." Before long, the exaggeration native to those in high society gave birth to and accumulated the most amusing ideas, the most outrageous expressions, the most ridiculous anecdotes about this mysterious personage. Although not a vampire, a ghoul, or an artificial man, a kind of Faust or Robin Goodfellow, people fond of fantasy said he had something of all these anthropomorphic natures about him. Here and there, one came across some Germans who accepted as fact these clever witticisms of Parisian scandal-mongering. The stranger was merely an old man. Many of the young men who were in the habit of settling the future of Europe every morning in a few elegant phrases would have liked to see in this stranger some great criminal, the possessor of vast wealth. Some storytellers recounted the life of this old man and provided really curious details about the atrocities he had committed while in the service of the Maharaja of Mysore. Some bankers, more oscillative by nature, invented a fable about money. But, they said, shrugging their shoulders in pity, this poor old man is a tête genoiselle, sir. Without being indiscreet, could you please tell me what you mean by a tête genoise? A man, sir, with an enormous lifetime capital and whose family's income doubtless depends on his good health. Remember having heard at Madame d'Espard's, a hypnotist proing on highly suspect historical data, that this old man, preserved under glass, was the famous Balsamo, known as Cagliostro. Accord. 226. Ing to this contemporary alchemist, the Sicilian adventurer had escaped death and passed his time fabricating gold for his grandchildren. Last, the bailiff of Ferret maintained that he had recognized this odd personage as the Count of Saint-Sermain. Vague stupidities, spoken in witty accents, with the mocking air character istic of atheistic society in our day, kept alive vague suspicions about the Lanty family. Finally, through a strange combination of circumstances, the members of this family fussed at everyone's conjectures by behaving somewhat mysteriously toward this old man, whose life was somehow hidden from all investigation. Whenever this person crossed the threshold of the room he was supposed to inhabit in the Lanty mansion, his appearance ways created a great sensation among the family. One might have called it an event of great importance. Filippo, Marianina, Madame de Lanty, and an old servant were the only persons privileged to assist the old man in walking, arising, sitting down. Each of them watched over his slightest movement. It seemed that he was an enchanted being upon whom depended the happiness, the life, or the fortune of them all. Was it affection or fear? Those in society were unable to discover any clue to help them solve this problem. Hidden for whole months in the depths of a secret sanctuary, this family genie would suddenly come forth, unexpectedly, and would appear in the midst of the salons like those fairies of bygone days who descended from flying dragons to interrupt the rites to which they had not been invited. Only the most avid onlookers were then able to perceive the uneasiness of the heads of the house, who could conceal their feelings with unusual skill. Sometimes, however, while dancing a quadrille, Marianina, naive as she was, would cast a terrified glance at the old man when she spied him among the crowd. Or else Filippo would leap quickly through the throng to his side and would stay near him, tender and attentive, as though contact with others or the slightest breath would destroy this strange creature. The Countess would make a point of drawing near, without seeming to have any intention of joining them. Then, assuming a manner and expression of servitude mixed with tenderness, submission, and power, she would say a few words, to which the old man nearly always deferred, and he would disappear. Led off, or, more. 227. Precisely, carried off, by her. If Madame de Lanty were not present, the Count used 1,000 stratagems to reach his side. However, he seemed to have difficulty making himself heard, and treated him like a spoiled child whose mother gives in to his whims in order to avoid a scene. Some bolder persons having thoughtlessly ventured to question the Count de Lanty, this cold, reserved man had appeared never to understand them. And so, after many tries, all futile because of the circumspection of the entire family, everyone stopped trying to fathom such a well-kept secret. Weary of trying, the companionable spies, the idly curious, and the politic all gave up bothering about this mystery. However, even now perhaps in these glittering salons there were some philosophers who, while eating an ice or a sherbet, or placing their empty punch glass on a side table, were saying to each other, "It wouldn't surprise me to learn that those people are crooks." The old man who hides and only makes his appearance on the first day of spring or winter, or at the solstices, looks to me like a killer or a confidence man. It's almost the same thing. Killing a man's fortune is sometimes worse than killing the man. Oh sir, I have bet 20 Louis, I should get back 40. But, sir, there are only 30 on the table. Ah well, you see how mixed the crowd is, here. It's impossible to play. True. But it's now nearly 6 months since we've seen the spirit. Do you think he's really alive? Ha! At best. These last words were spoken near me by people I did not know, as they were moving off, and as I was resuming, in an afterthought, my mixed thoughts of white and black, life and death. My vivid imagination as well as my eyes looked back and forth from the party, which had reached the height of its splendor, and the somber scene in the gardens. I do not know how long I meditated on these two faces of the human coin, but all at once I was awakened by the stiff laugh of a young woman. I was stunned by the appearance of the image which arose before me. By one of those 228 tricks of nature, the half-mournful thought turning in my mind had emerged, and it appeared living before me. It had sprung like Minerva from the head of Jove, tall and strong. It was at once 100 years old and 22 years old. It was alive and dead. He escaped from his room like lunatic from his cell. The little old man had obviously slipped behind a hedge of people who were listening to Marianin's voice, finishing the cavatina from Tancredi St. He seemed to have come out from underground, impelled by some piece of stage machinery. Motionless and somber, he stood for a moment gazing at the party, the noises of which had perhaps reached his ears. His almost somnambulatory preoccupation was concentrated on things that he was in the world without seeing it. He had unceremoniously sprung up next to one of the most ravishing women in Paris, a young and elegant dancer, delicately formed, with one of those faces as fresh as that of a child, pink and white, so frail and transparent that a man's glance seems to penetrate it like a ray of sunlight going through ice. They were both there before me, together, united, and so close that the stranger brushed against her, her gauzy dress, her garlands of flowers, her softly curled hair, her floating sash. I had brought this young woman to Madame de Lanty's ball. Since this was her first visit to the house, I forgave her her stifled laugh, but I quickly gave her a signal which completely silenced her and filled her with awe for her neighbor. She sat down next to me. The old man did not want to leave this lovely creature, to whom he had attached himself with that silent and seemingly baseless stubbornness to which the extremely old are prone, and which makes them appear childish. In order to sit near her, he had to take a folding chair. His slightest movements were full of that cold heaviness, the stupid indecision, characteristic of the gestures of a paralytic. He sat slowly down on his seat, with circumspection, muttering some unintelligible words. His worn-out voice was like the sound made by a stone falling down a well. The young woman held my hand tightly, as if seeking protection on some precipice, and she shivered when this man at whom she was looking turned upon her two eyes without warmth, glaucous eyes which could only be compared to dull mother of pearl. 229. I'm afraid, she said, leaning toward my ear. You can talk, I answered. He is very hard of hearing. Do you know him? Yes. Thereon, she gathered up enough courage to look for a moment at this creature for which the human language had no name, a form without substance, a being without life, or a life without action. She was under the spell of that timorous curiosity which leads women to seek out dangerous emotions, to go see chained tigers, to look at boa constrictors, frightening themselves because they are separated from them only by weak fences. Although the little old man's back was stooped like a laborer's, one could easily tell that he must have had at one time a normal shape. His excessive thinness, the delicacy of his limbs, proved that he had always been slender. He was dressed in black silk trousers which fell about his bony thighs in folds, like an empty sail. An anatomist would have promptly recognized the symptoms of galloping consumption by looking at the skinny legs supporting this strange body. You would have said they were two bones crossed on a tombstone. A feeling of profound horror for mankind gripped the heart when one saw the marks that decrepitude had left on this fragile machine. The stranger was wearing an old-fashioned gold-embroidered white waistcoat, and his linen was dazzlingly white. A frill of somewhat yellowed lace, rich enough for a queen's envy, fell into ruffles on his breast. On him, however, this lace seemed more like a rag than like an ornament. Centered on it was fabulous diamond which glittered like the sun. This outmoded luxury, this particular and tasteless jewel, made the strange creature's face even more striking. The setting was worthy of the portrait. This dark face was angular and all sunk in, the chin was sunken, the temples were sunken, the eyes were lost in yellowish sockets. The jawbones stood out because of his indescribable thinness, creating cavities in the center of each cheek. These deformations, more or less illuminated by the candles, produced shadows and strange reflections which succeeded in erasing any human characteristics from his face. And the years had glued the thin, yellow skin of his 230 face so closely to his skull that it was covered all over with a multitude of circular wrinkles, like the ripples on a pond into which a child has thrown a pebble, or star-shaped, like a cracked window pane, but everywhere deep and close-set as the edges of pages in a closed book. Some old people have presented more hideous portraits. What contributed the most, however, in lending the appearance of an artificial creature to the spectre which had risen up before us was the red and white with which he glistened. The eyebrows of his mask took from the light a luster which revealed that they were painted on. Fortunately for the eye depressed by the sight of such ruin, his cadaverous skull was covered by a blonde wig whose innumerable curls were evidence of an extraordinary pretension. As for the rest, the feminine coquetry of this phantasmagorical personage was rather strongly emphasized by the gold ornaments hanging from his ears, by the rings whose fine stones glittered on his bony fingers, and by a watch chain which shimmered like the brilliance of a choker around a woman's neck. Finally, the sort of Japanese idol had on his bluish lips a fixed and frozen smile, implacable and mocking, like a skull, silent and motionless as a statue. It exuded the musty odor of old clothes which the heirs of some duchess take out for inventory. Although the old man turned his eyes toward the crowd, it seemed that the movements of those orbs, incapable of sight, were accomplished only by means of some imperceptible artifice, and when the eyes came to rest on something, anyone looking at them would have concluded that they had not moved at all. To see, next to this human wreckage, a young woman whose neck, bosom, and arms were bare and white, whose figure was in the full bloom of its beauty, whose hair rose from her alabaster forehead and inspired love, whose eyes did not receive but gave off light, who was soft, fresh, and whose floating curls and sweet breath seemed too heavy, too hard, too powerful for this shadow, for this man of dust. Ah! Here were death and life indeed, I thought, in a fantastic arabesque, half-hideous chimera, divinely feminine from the waist up. Yet there are marriages like that often enough in the world, I said to myself. He smells like a graveyard, cried the terrified young woman. 231. Pressing against me for protection, and whose uneasy movements told me she was frightened. What a horrible sight, she went on. I can't stay here any longer. If I look at him again, I shall believe that death itself has come looking for me. Is he alive? She reached out to the phenomenon with that boldness women can summon up out of the strength of their desires, but she broke into a cold sweat, for no sooner had she touched the old man than she heard a cry like a rattle. This sharp voice, if voice it was, issued from a nearly dried up throat. Then the sound was quickly followed by a little, convulsive, childish cough of peculiar sonorousness. At this sound, Marianina Filio and Madame de Lanty looked in our direction, and their glances were like bolts of lightning. The young woman wished she were at the bottom of the Seine. She took my arm and led me into a side room. Men, women, everyone made way for us. At the end of the public rooms, we came into a small, semicircular chamber. My companion threw herself onto a divan, trembling with fright, oblivious to her surroundings. "Madam, you are mad," I said to her. "But," she replied, after a moment's silence, during which T gazed at her in admiration. Is it my fault? Why does Madame de Lanty allow ghosts to wander about in her house? Come, I replied, you are being ridiculous, taking a little old man for a ghost. Be still, she said, with that forceful and mocking air all women so easily assume when they want to be in the right. What a pretty room! She cried, looking around. Blue satin always makes such wonderful wall hangings. How refreshing it is! Oh! What a beautiful painting! She went on, getting up and going to stand before a painting in a magnificent frame. We stood for a moment in contemplation of this marvel, which seemed to have been painted by some supernatural brush. The picture was of Adonis lying on a lion's skin. The lamp hanging from the ceiling of the room in an alabaster globe illuminated this canvas with a soft glow which enabled us to make out all the beauties of the painting. Does such a perfect creature exist? She asked me, after 232. Having, with a soft smile of contentment, examined the exquisite grace of the contours, the pose, the color, the hair, in short, the entire picture. He is too beautiful for a man, she added, after an examination such as she might have made of some rival. Oh! How jealous I then felt, something in which a poet had vainly tried to make me believe, the jealousy of engravings, of pictures, wherein artists exaggerate human beauty according to the doctrine which leads them to idealize everything. It's a portrait, I replied, the product of the talent of Veen, but that great painter never saw the original, and maybe you'd admire it less if you knew that this dog was copied from the statue of a woman. But who is it? I hesitated. I want to know, she added, impetuously. I believe, I replied, that this Adonis is a relative of Madame de Lanty. I had the pain of seeing her wrapped in the contemplation of this figure. She sat in silence. I sat down next to her and took her hand without her being aware of it. Forgotten for a painting. At this moment, the light footsteps of a woman in a rustling dress broke the silence. Young Marianina came in, and her innocent expression made her even more alluring than did her grace and her lovely dress. She was walking slowly and escorting with maternal care, with filial solicitude, the costumed spectre who had made us flee from the music room and whom she was leading, watching with what seemed to be concern as he slowly advanced on his feeble feet. They went together with some difficulty to a door hidden behind a tapestry. There, Marianina knocked softly. At once, as if by magic, a tall, stern man, a kind of family genie, appeared. Before entrusting the old man to the care of his mysterious guardian, the child respectfully kissed the walking course, and her chaste caress was not devoid of that graceful cajolery of which some privileged women possess the secret. Addio, addio, she said, with the prettiest inflection in her youthful voice. 233. She added to the final syllable a marvelously well executed trill, but in a soft voice, as if to give poetic expression to the emotions in her heart. Suddenly struck by some memory, the old man stood on the threshold of this secret hideaway. Then, through the silence, we heard the heavy sigh that came from his chest. She took the most beautiful of the rings which adorned his skeletal fingers, and placed it in Marianina's bosom. The young girl broke into laughter, took the ring, and slipped it onto her finger over her glove. Then she walked quickly toward the salon, from which there could be heard the opening measures of a quadrille. She saw us. Ah, you were here, she said, blushing. After having seemed as I about to question us, Ghe to her partner with the careless petulance of youth. What did that mean? My young companion asked me. Is he her husband? I must be dreaming. Where am I? You, I replied, you, madam, swearier as you are, you who understand so well the most hidden feelings, who know how to inspire in a man's heart the most delicate of feelings without blighting it, without breaking it at the outset, you who pity heartache and who combine the wit of a Parisienne with a passionate soul worthy of Italy or Spain. She perceived the bitter irony in my speech, then, without seeming to have heard, she interrupted me. Oh, you fashion me to your own taste. What tyrannil you don't want me for myself. Ah, I want nothing, I cried, taken aback by her severity. Is it true, at least, that you enjoy hearing stories of those vivid passions that ravishing southern women inspire in our hearts? Why yes, so. So, you call tomorrow around 9 and reveal this mystery to you. No, she replied, I want to know now. You haven't yet given me the right to obey you when you say, I want to. At this moment, she replied with maddening coquetry, I have the most burning desire to know the secret. Tomorrow, I might not even listen to you. 234. She smiled and we parted, she just as proud, just as forbidding, and I just as ridiculous as ever. She had the audacity to waltz with a young aide-de-camp, and I was left in turn angry, pouting, admiring, loving, jealous. Till tomorrow, she said, around 2 in the morning, as she left the ball. I won't go, I thought to myself. T'll give you up. You are more capricious, perhaps 1,000 times more fanciful than my imagination. The next evening, we were both seated before a good fire in a small, elegant salon, she on a low sofa, I on cushions almost at her feet, and my eyes below hers. The street was quiet. The lamp shed a soft light. It was one of those evenings pleasing to the soul, one of those never to be forgotten moments, one of those hours spent in peace and desire whose charm, later on, is a matter for constant regret, even when we may be happier. Who can erase the vivid imprint of the first feelings of love? Well, she said, listening. I don't dare begin. The story has some dangerous passages for its teller. If I become too moved, you must stop me. Tell, I will obey. Ernest Jean Sarrasine was the only son of a lawyer in the Franche-Comté, I went on, after a pause. His father had amassed 6 or 8,000 livres of income honestly enough, a professional's fortune which at that time in the provinces, was considered to be colossal. The elder Sarrasine, having but one child and anxious to overlook nothing where his education was concerned, hoped to make a magistrate of him, and to live long enough to see, in his old age, the grandson of Mathieu Sarrasine, farmer of Saint-Die, seated beneath the lilies and napping through some trial for the greater glory of the law. However, heaven did not hold this pleasure in store for the lawyer. The younger Sarrasine, entrusted to the Jesuits at an early age, evidenced an unusual turbulence. He had the childhood of a man of talent. He would study only what pleased him, Fr. 235. Quaintly rebelled, and sometimes spent hours on end plunged in confused thought, occupied at times in watching his comrades at play, at times dreaming of Homeric heroes. Then, if he made up his mind to amuse himself, he threw himself into games with an extraordinary ardor. When a fight broke out between him and a friend, the battle rarely ended without bloodshed. If he was the weaker of the two, he would bite. Both active and passive by turns, without aptitude and not overly intelligent, his bizarre character actor made his teachers as wary of him as were his classmates. Instead of learning the elements of Greek, he drew the reverend father as he explained a passage in Thucydides to them, sketched the mathematics teacher, the tutors, the father in charge of discipline, and he scribbled shapeless designs on the walls. Instead of singing the Lord's praises in church, he distracted himself during services by whittling on Q-Pew, OT when he had stolen a piece of wood. He carved some holy figure if he had no wood, pencil, he reproduced his ideas with bread crumbs. Whether copying the characters in the pictures that decorated the choir, or improvising, he always left behind him some gross sketches whose licentiousness shocked the youngest fathers. Evil tongues maintained that the older Jesuits were amused by them. Finally, if we are to believe school gossip, he was expelled for having, while awaiting his turn at the confessional on Good Friday, shaped a big stick of wood into the form of Christ. The impiety with which the statue was endowed was too blatant not to have merited punishment of the artist. Had he not had the audacity to place this somewhat oinical figure on top of the tabernacle, Sarrasine sought in Paris a refuge from the effects of a father's curse. Having one of those strong wills that brook no obstacle, he obeyed the commands of his genius and entered Bouchardon's studio. He worked all day, and in the evening went out to beg for his living. Astonished at the young artist's progress and intelligence, Bouchardon soon became aware of his pupil's poverty. He helped him, grew fond of him, and treated him like his own son. Then, when Sarrasine's genius was revealed in one of those works in which future talent struggles with the effervescence of youth, the warm-hearted Bouchardon endeavored to 236. Restore him to the old lawyer's good graces. Before the authority of the famous sculptor, the parental anger subsided. All Besançon rejoiced at having given birth to a great man of the future. In the first throes of the ecstasy produced by his flattered vanity, the surly lawyer gave his son the means to cut a good figure in society for a long time. The lengthy and laborious studies demanded by sculpture tamed Sarrasine's impetuous nature and wild genius. Bouchardon, foreseeing the violence with which the passions would erupt in this young soul, which was perhaps predisposed to them as Michelangelo's had been, channeled his energy into constant labor. He succeeded in keeping Sarrasine's extraordinary impetuosity within limits by forbidding him to work, by suggesting distractions when he saw him being carried away by the fury of some idea, or by entrusting him with important work when he seemed on the point of abandoning himself to dissipation. However, gentleness was always the most powerful of weapons where this passionate soul was concerned, and the master had no greater control over his student than when he inspired his gratitude through paternal kindness. At 22, Sarrasine was necessarily removed from the salutary influence Bouchardon had exercised over his morals and his habits. He reaped the fruits of his genius by winning the sculpture prize established by the Marquis de Marigny, the brother of Madame de Pompadour, who did so much for the arts. Diderot hailed the statue by Bouchardon's pupil as a masterpiece. The king's sculptor, not without great sorrow, saw off to Italy a young man whom he had kept, as a matter of principle, in total ignorance of the facts of life. For 6 years, Sarrasine had boarded with Bouchardon. As fanatic in his art as Canova was later to be, he arose at dawn, went to the studio, did not emerge until nightfall, and lived only with his muse. If he went to the Comédie Française, he was taken by his master. He felt so out of place at Madame Geoffrin's and in high society, into which Bouchardon tried to introduce him, that he preferred to be alone, and shunned the pleasures of that licentious era. He had no other mistress but sculpture and Clotilde, one of the luminaries of the opera, and even this affair did not last. 237. Sarrasine was rather ugly, always badly dressed, and so free in his nature, so irregular in his private life, that the celebrated nymph, fearing some catastrophe, soon relinquished the sculptor to his love of the arts. Sophie Arnould made one of her witticisms on this subject. She confessed her surprise, I believe, that her friend had managed to triumph over statuary. Sarrasine left for Italy during the journey, his vivid imagination caught fire beneath a brilliant sky and at the sight of the wonderful monuments which are to be found in the birthplace of the arts. He admired the statues, the frescoes, the paintings, and thus inspired, he came to Rome, filled with desire to carve his name between Michelangelo's and M. Bouchardon's. Accordingly, at the beginning, he divided his time between studio tasks and examining the works of art in which Rome abounds. He had already spent 2 weeks in the ecstatic state which overwhelms young minds at the sight of the Queen of Ruins, when he went one evening to the Teatro Argentina, before which a huge crowd was assembled. He inquired as to the causes of this gathering, and everyone answered with 2 names, Zambinella. Jamalil. He entered and took a seat in the orchestra, squeezed between 2 notably fat abbati. However, he was lucky enough to be fairly close to the stage. The curtain rose. For the first time in his life, he heard that music, whose delights M. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had so eloquently praised to him at one of Baron de Holbach's evenings. The young sculptor's senses were, so to speak, lubricated by the accents of Jamali's sublime harmony. The languorous novelties of these skillfully mingled Italian voices plunged him into a delicious ecstasy. Plus he remained speechless, motionless. not even feeling crowded by the two priests. His solaced into his ears and eyes. He seemed to hear through every oar. Suddenly a burst of applause which shook the house greeted the prima donna's entrance. She came coquettishly to the front of the stage and greeted the audience with infinite grace. The lights, the general enthusiasm, the theatrical illusion, the glamour of a style of dress which in those days was quite attractive, all conspired in favor of this woman. Sarrasine cried out with pleasure. At that instant he marveled at the ideal beauty he had hitherto. 238. Erdo sought in life, seeking in one often unworthy model the roundness of a perfect leg, in another, the curve of a breast, in another, white shoulders, finally taking some girl's neck, some woman's hands, and some child's smooth knees, without ever having encountered under the cold Parisian sky the rich, sweet creations of ancient Greece. La Zambinella displayed to him, united, living, and delicate, those exquisite female forms he so ardently desired, of which a sculptor is at once the severest and the most passionate judge. Her mouth was expressive, her eyes loving, her complexion dazzlingly white. And along with these details, which would have enraptured a painter, were all the wonders of those images of Venus revered and rendered by the chisels of the Greeks. The artist never wearied of admiring the inimitable grace with which the arms were attached to the torso, the marvelous roundness of the neck, the harmonious lines drawn by the eyebrows, the nose, and the perfect oval of the face, the purity of its vivid contours and the effect of the thick, curved lashes which lined her heavy and voluptuous eyelids. This was more than a woman, this was a masterpiece. In this unhoped-for creation could be found a love to enrapture any man, and beauties worthy of satisfying a critic. With his eyes, Sarrasine devoured Pygmalion's statue, come down from its pedestal. When La Zambinella sang, the effect was delirium. The artist felt cold, then he felt a heat which suddenly began to prickle in the innermost depth of his being, in what we call the heart. For lack of any other wordle he did not applaud, he said nothing, he experienced an impulse of madness, a kind of frenzy which overcomes us only when we are at the age when desire has something frightening and infernal about it. Sarrasine wanted to leap onto the stage and take possession of this woman. His strength, increased 100-fold by a moral depression impossible to explain, since these phenomena occur in an area hidden from human observation, seemed to manifest itself with painful violence. Looking at him, one would have thought him a cold and senseless man. Fame, knowledge, future, existence, laurels, everything collapsed to be loved by her, or die. Such was the decree Sarrasine passed upon himself. He was so utterly intoxicated that he no 239 longer saw the theatre, the spectators, the actors, or heard the music. Moreover, the distance between himself and La Zambinella had ceased to exist. He possessed her, his eyes were riveted upon her, he took her for his own. An almost diabolical power enabled him to feel the breath of this voice, to smell the scented powder covering her hair, to see the planes of her face, to count the blue veins shadowing her satin skin. Last, this agile voice, fresh and silvery in timbre, supple as a thread shaped by the slightest breath of air, rolling and unrolling, cascading and scattering, this voice attacked his soul so vividly that several times he gave vent to involuntary cries torn from him by convulsive feelings of pleasure which are all too rarely vouchsafed by human passions. He was presently obliged to leave the theatre. His trembling legs almost refused to support him. He was limp, weak as a sensitive man who has given way to overwhelming anger. He had experienced such pleasure, or perhaps he had suffered so keenly, that his life had drained away like water from a broken vase. He felt empty inside, a prostration similar to the debilitation that overcomes those convalescing from serious illness. Overcome by an inexplicable sadness, he sat down on the steps of a church. There, leaning back against a pillar, he fell into a confused meditation, as in a dream. He had been smitten by passion. Upon returning to his lodgings, he fell into one of those frenzies of activity which disclose to us the presence of new elements in our lives. A prey to this first fever of love derived equally from both pleasure and he tried to appease his impatience and his delirium by drawing La Zambinella from memory. It was a kind of embodied meditation. On one page, La Zambinella appeared in that apparently calm and cool pose favored by Raphael, Giorgione, and every great inter. On another, she was delicately turning her head after having finished a trill, and appeared to be listening to herself. Sarrasine sketched his mistress in every pose. He drew her unveiled, seated, standing, lying down, chaste or amorous, embodying through the delirium of his pencils every capricious notion that can enter our heads when we think intently about mistress. However, his fevered thoughts went beyond drawing. He saw La Zambinella, spoke to her, beseeched her, he 240. Passed 1,000 years of life and happiness with her by placing her in every imaginable position, in short by sampling the future with her. On the following day, he sent his valet to rent box next to the stage for the entire séance. Then, like all young people with lusty souls, he exaggerated to himself the difficulties of his undertaking and first fed his passion with the pleasure of being able to admire his mistress without obstruction. This golden age of love, during which we take pleasure in our own feeling and in which we are happy almost by ourselves, not destined to last long in Sarrasine's case. Nevertheless, events took him by surprise so while he was still under the spell of this vernal hallucination, as naive as it was voluptuous. In a week he lived a lifetime, spending the mornings kneading the clay by which he would copy La Zambinella, despite the veils, skirts, corsets, and ribbons which concealed her from him. In the evenings, installed in his box early, alone, lying on sofa like a Turk under the influence of opium, he created for himself a pleasure as rich and varied as he wished it to be. First, he gradually familiarized himself with the overly vivid emotions his mistress's singing afforded him, he then trained his eyes to see her, and finally he could contemplate her without fearing an outburst of the wild frenzy which had seized him on the first day. As his passion became calmer it grew dear for the rest. The unsociable sculptor did not allow his friends to intrude upon his solitude, which was peopled with images, adorned with fantasies of hope, and filled with happiness. His love was so strong, so endive, that he experienced all the innocent scruples that assail us when we love for the first time. As he began to realize that he would soon have to act, to plot, to inquire where La Zambinella lived, whether she had a mother, uncle, teacher, family, to ponder, in short, on ways to see her, speak to her, these great, ambitious thoughts made his heart swell so painfully that he put them off until later, deriving as much satisfaction from his physical suffering as he did from his intellectual pleasures. But, Madame de Rochefide interrupted me, I still don't see anything about either Marianina or her little old man. 241. You are seeing nothing but him. I cried impatiently, like an author who is being forced to spoil a theatrical effect. For several days, I resumed after a pause, Sarrasine had reappeared so faithfully in his box and his eyes had expressed such love that his passion for La Zambinella's voice would have been common knowledge throughout Paris, had this adventure happened there. However, in Italy, madam, everyone goes to the theatre for himself, with his own passions, and with a heartfelt interest which precludes spying through opera glasses. Nevertheless, the sculptor's enthusiasm did not escape the attention of the singers for long. One evening, the Frenchman saw that they were laughing at him in the wings. It is hard to know what extreme actions he might not have taken had La Zambinella not come onto the stage. She gave Sarrasine one of those eloquent glances which often reveal much more than women intend them to. This glance was a total revelation. Sarrasine was loveable if it's only a caprice, he thought, already accusing his mistress of excessive ardor. She doesn't know what she is subjecting herself to. I am hoping her caprice will last my whole life. At that moment, the artist's attention was distracted by 3 soft knocks on the door of his box. He opened it. An old woman entered with an air of mystery. "Young man," she said, "if you want to be happy, be prudent. Put on a cape, wear a hat drawn down over your eyes, then, around 10 in the evening, be in the Via del Corso in front of the Hotel d'Espagne. T'll be there, he replied, placing 2 louis in the Douane's wrinkled hand. He left his box after having given a signal to La Zambinella, who timidly lowered her heavy eyelids, like a woman pleased to be understood at last. Then he ran home to dress himself as seductively as he could. As he was leaving the theatre, a strange man took his arm. "Be on your guard, Frenchman," he whispered in his ear. "This is a matter of life and death. Cardinal Cicognara is her protector and doesn't trifle." 242. At that moment, had some demon set the pit of hell between Sarrasine and La Zambinella, he would have crossed it with one leap. Like the horses of the gods described by Homer, the sculptor's love had traversed vast distances in the twinkling of an eye. "If death itself were waiting for me outside the house, I would go even faster," he replied. "Poverino," the stranger cried as he disappeared. Speaking of danger to a lover is tantamount to selling him pleasures, is it not? So Sarrasine's valet had never seen his master take so much care over his toilette. His finest sword, a gift from Bouchardon, the sash Clotilde had given him, his embroidered coat, his silver brocade waistcoat, his gold snuff-box, his jeweled watches, were all taken from their coffers, and he adorned himself like a girl about to appear before her first love. At the appointed hour, drunk with love and seething with hope, Sarrasine, concealed in his cape, sped to the rendezvous the old woman had given him. The duenna was waiting for him. "You took a long time," she said, "How's come?" She led the Frenchman along several back streets and stopped before a rather handsome mansion. So she knocked, as the door opened, so she led Sarrasine along a labyrinth of stairways, Gauler, IES, and rooms which were lit only by the feeble light of the moon, and soon came to a door through whose cracks gleamed bright lights and from behind which came the joyful sounds of several voices. When at a word from the old woman he was admitted to this mysterious room, Sarrasine was suddenly dazzled at finding himself in a salon as brilliantly lighted as it was sumptuously furnished, in the center of which stood a table laden with venerable bottles and flashing flagons sparkling with ruby facets. He recognized the singers from the theater, along with some charming women, all ready to begin an artist's orgy as soon as he was among them. Sarrasine suppressed a feeling of disappointment and put on a good face. He had expected a dim room, his mistress seated by the fire, some jealous Sarrasine nearby, death and love, am exchange of confidences in low voices, heart to heart, dangerous kisses and faces so close that La Zambinelle's hair would have caressed his forehead throbbing with desire, feverish with happiness. 243. "Vive la folie!" he cried. "Signore e bel done, you will allow me to take my revenge later and to show you my gratitude for the way you have welcomed a poor sculptor." Having been greeted warmly enough by most of those present, whom he knew by sight, he sought to approach the armchair on which La Zambinella was casually reclining. Ah! How his heart beat when he spied a delicate foot shod in one of those slippers which in those days, may I say, madam, gave women's feet such a coquettish and voluptuous look that I don't know how men were able to resist them. The well-fitting white stockings with green clocks, the short skirts, the slippers with pointed toes, and the high heels of Louis XV's reign may have contributed something to the demoralization of Euro and the clergy. Something. The Marquise replied. Have you read nothing? La Zambinella, I continued, smiling, had impudently crossed her legs and was gently swinging the upper one with a certain attractive indolence which suited her capricious sort of beauty. She had removed her costume and was, wearing a bodice that accentuated her narrow waist and set off the satin panniers of her dress, which was embroidered with blue flowers. Her bosom, the treasures of which were concealed, in an excess of coquetry, by a covering of lace, was dazzlingly white. Her hair arranged something like that of Madame du Barry. Her face, though it was partially hidden under a full bonnet, appeared only the more delicate, and powder suited her. To see her thus was to adore her. She gave the sculptor a graceful smile. Unhappy at not being able to speak to her without witnesses present, Sarrasine politely sat down next to her and talked about music, praising her extraordinary talent, but his voice trembled with love, with fear and hope. "What are you afraid of?" asked Vitagliani, the company's most famous singer. "Go ahead, you need fear no rivals here." Having said this, the tenor smiled without another word. This smile was repeated on the lips of all the guests, whose attention contained a hidden malice a lover would not have noticed. Such openness was like a dagger thrust in Sarrasine's heart. Although endowed with a certain strength of character, and although nothing 244 could change his love, as it had perhaps not yet occurred to him that La Zambinella was virtually a courtesan, and that he could not have both the pure pleasures that make a young girl's love delicious and the tempestuous transport by which the hazardous accession of an actress must be purchased. He reflected and resigned himself. A supper was served. Sarrasine and La Zambinella sat down informally side by side. For the first half of the meal, the artists preserved some decorum, so the sculptor was able to chat with the singer. He found her witty, acute, too, but astonishingly ignorant, and she revealed herself to be weak and superstitious. The delicacy of her organs was reflected in her understanding. When Vitagliani uncorked the first bottle of champagne, Sarrasine read in his companion's eyes a start of terror at the tiny explosion caused by the escape gas. The love-stricken artist interpreted the involuntary shudder of this feminine constitution as the sign of an excessive sensitivity. The Frenchman was charmed by this weakness. How much is protective in a man's love? My strength your shield. Is this not written at the heart of all declarations of love? Too excited to shower the beautiful Italian with compliments, Sarrasine, like all lovers, was by turns serious, laughing, or reflective. Although he seemed to be listening to the other guests, he did not hear a word they were saying, so absorbed was he in the pleasure of finding himself beside her, touching her hand as he served her. He bathed in a secret joy. Despite the eloquence of a few mutual glances, he was astonished at the reserve La Zambinella maintained toward him. Indeed, she had begun by pressing his foot and teasing him with the flirtatiousness of a woman in love and free to show it, but she suddenly wrapped herself in the modesty of a young girl, softer. Hearing Sarrasine describe a trait which revealed the excessive violence of his character. So when the supper became an orgy, guests broke into song under the influence of the Peralta and the Pedro Ximénez. There were ravishing duets, songs from Calabria, Spanish seguidillas, Neapolitan canzonettas. Intoxication was in every eye, in the music, in hearts and voices alike. Suddenly an enchanting vivacity welled up, a gay abandon, an Italian warmth of feeling Incan. 245. Seeable to those acquainted only with Parisian gatheringa, London routs, or Viennese circles. So jokes and words of love flew like bulletinlets in a battle through laughter, rofanities, and invocationa to the Holy Virgin or Il Bambino. Someone lay down on a sofa and fell asleep. A girl was listening to a declaration of love unaware that she was spilling sherry on the tablecloth. In the midst of this disorder, La Zambinella remained thoughtful, as though terror-struck. She refused to drink, perhaps she ate a bit too much. However, it is said that greediness in a woman is a charming quality. Admiring his mistress's modesty, Sarrasine thought seriously about the future. She probably wants to be married, he thought. He then turned his thoughts to the delights of this marriage. His whole life seemed too short to exhaust the springs of happiness he found in the depths of his soul. Sos Vitagliani, who was sitting next to him, refilled his glass often that, toward 3 in the morning, without being totally drunk, Sarrasine could no longer control his delirium. Impetuously, he picked up the woman, escaping into a kind of boudoir next to the salon, toward the door of which he had glanced more than once. The Italian woman was armed with a dagger. "If you come any closer," she said, "I will be forced to plunge this weapon into your heart. Let me go, you would despise me. I have conceived too much respect for your character to surrender in this fashion. I don't want to betray the feeling you have for me. Oh no. cried Sarrasine, you cannot stifle a passion by stimulating idle. Are you already so corrupt that, old in heart, you would act like a young courtesan who whets the emotions by which she plies her trade? But today is Friday, she replied, affrighted at the Frenchman's violence. Sarrasine, who was not devout, broke into laughter. La Zambinella jumped up like a young deer and ran toward the salon. When Sarrasine appeared in her pursuit, he was greeted by an infernal burst of laughter. He saw La Zambinella lying in a swoon upon a sofa. She was pale and drained by the extraordinary effort she had just made. 246. Although Sarrasine knew little Italian, so he heard his mistress saying in a low voice to Vitagliani, "But he will kill me." The sculptor was utterly confounded by this strange scene. He regained his senses. At first he stood motionless, then he found his voice, sat down next to his mistress, and assured her of his respect. He was able to divert his passion by addressing the most high-minded phrases to this woman, and in depicting his love, he used all the resources of that magical eloquence that inspired intermediary which women rarely refuse to believe. So when the guests were surprised by the first gleams of morning light, a woman suggested they go to Frascati. Everyone enthusiastically fell in with the idea of spending the day at the Villa Ludovisi. Vitagliani went down to hire some carriages. Os Sarrasine had the pleasure of leading La Zambinella to a phaeton. Once outside Rome, the gaiety which had been momentarily repressed by each person's battle with sleepiness suddenly revived. Men and women alike seemed used to this strange life, these ceaseless pleasures, this artist's impulsiveness which turns life into a perpetual party at which one laughed unreservedly. The sculptor's companion was the only one who seemed downcast. "Are you ill?" Sarrasine asked her. "Would you rather go home?" "Am not strong enough to stand all these excesses," she replied. "I must be very careful, but with you I feel so well. Had it not been for you, I would never have stayed for supper. A sleepless night and I lose whatever bloom I have." "You are so delicate," Sarrasine said, looking at the charming creature's pretty face. "Orgies ruin the voice. See now that we're alone," the artist cried, "and you no longer need fear the outbursts of my passion. Tell me that you love me." "So why?" she replied. "What would be the use? I seemed pretty to you. But you are French and your feelings will ask. Ah, you would not love me as I long to be loved." "How can you say that?" "Not to satisfy any vulgar passion, purely. I abhor men perhaps even more than I hate women. I need to seek refuge in friendship. For me, the world is a desert. I am an accursed cred." Although Sarrasine knew little Italian, so he heard his mistress saying in a low voice to Vitagliani, "But he will kill me." The sculptor was utterly confounded by this strange scene. He regained his senses. At first he stood motionless, then he found his voice, sat down next to his mistress, and assured her of his respect. He was able to divert his passion by addressing the most high-minded phrases to this woman, and in depicting his love, he used all the resources of that magical eloquence that inspired intermediary which women rarely refuse to believe. So when the guests were surprised by the first gleams of morning light, a woman suggested they go to Frascati. Everyone enthusiastically fell in with the idea of spending the day at the Villa Ludovisi. Vitagliani went down to hire some carriages. Os Sarrasine had the pleasure of leading La Zambinella to a phaeton. Once outside Rome, the gaiety which had been momentarily repressed by each person's battle with sleepiness suddenly revived. Men and women alike seemed used to this strange life, these ceaseless pleasures, this artist's impulsiveness which turns life into a perpetual party at which one laughed unreservedly. The sculptor's companion was the only one who seemed downcast. "Are you ill?" Sarrasine asked her. "Would you rather go home?" "Am not strong enough to stand all these excesses," she replied. "I must be very careful, but with you I feel so well. Had it not been for you, I would never have stayed for supper. A sleepless night and I lose whatever bloom I have." "You are so delicate," Sarrasine said, looking at the charming creature's pretty face. Orgies ruin the voice. See, now that we're alone, the artist cried, and you no longer need fear the outbursts of my passion. Tell me that you love me. So why? She replied. What would be the use? I seemed pretty to you. But you are French and your feelings will ask. Ah, you would not love me as I long to be loved. How can you say that? Not to satisfy any vulgar passion, purely. I abhor men perhaps even more than I hate women. I need to seek refuge in friendship. For me, the world is a desert, I am an accursed cred. 247. Tour, condemned to understand happiness, to feel it, to desire it, and, like many others, forced to see it flee from me continually. Remember, sir, that I will not have deceived you. I forbid you to love me. So I can be your devoted friend, for admire your strength and your character, I need a brother, a protector. Be all that for me, but no more. Not love you. Sarrasine cried. But my dearest angel, you are my life, my happiness. If I were to say one word, you would repulse me with horror. Coquettel, nothing can frighten me. Tell me you will cost my future, that I will die in 2 months, that I will be damned merely for having kissed you. He kissed her, despite La Zambinelle's efforts to resist this passionate embrace. Tell me you are a devil, that you want my money, my name, all my fame. Do you want me to give up being a sculptor? Tell me. And if I were not a woman? La Zambinella asked in a soft silvery voice. What a jokel, Sarrasine cried, do you think you can deceive an artist's eye? Haven't I spent 10 days devouring, scrutinizing, admiring your perfection? Only a woman could hay this round, soft arm, these elegant curves. You want compliments. She smiled at him sadly, and raising her eyes heavenward, she murmured, fatale beauty. At that moment her gaze had an indescribable expression of horror, so powerful and vivid that Sarrasine shuddered. Frenchman, she went on, forget this moment of madness forever. I respect you, but as for love, do not ask it of me, that feeling is smothered in my heart. I have no heart. She cried, weeping. The stage where you saw me, that applause, that music, that fame I am condemned to, such is my life, I have no other. Plus in a few hours you will not see me in the same way, the woman you love will be dead. The sculptor made no reply, he was overcome with a dumb rage which oppressed his heart. He could only gaze with inflamed, burning eyes at this extraordinary woman. La Zambinelle's weak. 248. Voice, her manner, her movements and gestures marked with melancholy, and discouragement, awakened all the wealth of passion in his soul. Each word was a goad. At that moment they reached Frascati. As the artist offered his mistress his arm to assist her in alighting, he felt her shiver. What is wrong? You would kill me, he cried, seeing her grow pale, if I were even an innocent cause of your slightest unhappy. Pes. A snake, she said, pointing to a grass snake which was sliding along a ditch. I am afraid of those horrid creatures. Sarrasine crushed the snake's head with his heel. How can you be so brave? La Zambinella continued, looking with visible horror at the dead reptile. Ah, the artist replied, smiling, now do you dare deny you are a woman? They rejoined their companions and strolled through the woods of the Villa Ludovisi, which in those days belonged to Cardinal Cicognara. That morning fled too quickly for the enamored sculptor, but it was filled with a host of incidents which revealed to him the coquetry, the weakness and the delicacy of this soft and enervated being. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. It happened that as they were wandering in the open countryside, the Hittel group of merry singers saw in the distance some heavily armed men whose manner of dress was far from reassuring. Someone said, they must be highwaymen, and everyone quickened his pace toward the refuge of the cardinal's grounds. At this critical moment, Sarrasine saw from La Zambinella's pallor that she no longer had the strength to walk. He took her up in his arms and carried her for a while, running. When he came to a nearby arbor, he put her down. "Explain to me," he said, "how this extreme weakness, which I would find hideous in any other woman, which would displease me and whose slightest indication would be almost enough to choke my love, pleases and charms me in you. Ah, how I love." 249. "You," he went on. "All your faults, your terrors, your resentments, add an indefinable grace to your soul. Think I would detest a strong woman, a Sappho, a courageous Iracher, full of energy and passion. Oh, soft, frail creature, how could you be otherwise? That angelic voice, that delicate voice would be an anomaly coming from any body but yours. I cannot give you any hope," she said. "Stop speaking to me in this way, because they will make a fool of you. I cannot stop you from coming to the theater, but if you love me or if you are wise, you will come there no more. Listen, monsieur," she said in a low voice. "Oh, be still," the impassioned artist said, "obstacles make my love more ardent." La Zambinella's graceful and modest attitude did not change, but she fell silent as though a terrible thought had revealed some misfortune to her. When it came time to return to Rome, she got into the four-seated coach, ordering the sculptor with imperious cruelty to return to Rouen alone in the carriage during the journey. Sarrasine resolved to kidnap La Zambinella. He spent the entire day making plans, each more outrageous than the other. At nightfall, as he was going out to inquire where his mistress's palazzo was located, he met one of his friends on the threshold. "My dear fellow," he said, "our ambassador has asked me to invite you to his house tonight. He is giving a magnificent concert, and when I tell you that Zambinella will be there." "Zambinella," cried Sarrasine, intoxicated by the name, "I'm mad about her." "You're like everyone else," his friend replied. "If you are my friends, you, Vien, Lauterbourg, and Allegrain, will you help me do something after the party?" Sarrasine asked. "It's not some cardinal to be killed?" "Not." No, Sarrasine said, "I'm not asking you to do anything an honest person couldn't do." In a short time, the sculptor had arranged everything for the success of his undertaking. He was one of the last to arrive at the ambassador's, but he had come in a traveling carriage drawn by 25 powerful horses and driven by one of the most enterprising veterani of Rome. The ambassador's palazzo was crowded, so's not without some difficulty. The sculptor, who was a stranger to everyone present, made his way to the salon where Zambinella was singing at that very moment. "Is it out of consideration for the cardinals, bishops, and abbés present," Sarrasine asked, "that she is dressed like a man, that she is wearing a snood, kinky hair, and a sword?" "Plus she? What she?" asked the old nobleman to whom Sarrasine had been speaking. "La Zambinella. La Zambinella," the Roman prince replied. "Are you joking? Where are you from? Has there ever been a woman on the Roman stage? And don't you know about the creatures who sing female roles in the Papal States? I am the one, monsieur, who gave Zambinella his voice. I paid for everything that scamp ever had, even his singing teacher. He has so little gratitude for the service I rendered him that he has never consented to set foot in my house. And yet, if he makes a fortune, he will owe it all to me." Prince Chigi may well have gone on talking for some time. Sarrasine was not listening to him. A horrid truth had crept into his soul. It was as though he had been struck by lightning. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the false singer. His fiery gaze exerted a sort of magnetic influence on Zambinella, for the musico finally turned to look at Sarrasine, and at that moment his heavenly voice faltered. He trembled. An involuntary mute murmur escaping from the audience he had kept hanging on his lips completed his discomfiture. He sat down and cut short his aria. Cardinal Cicognara, who had glanced out the corner of his eye to see what had attracted his protégé's attention, then saw the Frenchman. He leaned over to one of his ecclesiastical aides-de-camp and appeared to be asking the sculptor's name. Having obtained the answer he sought, he regarded the artist with great attention and gave an order to an abbé, who quickly disappeared. During this time, Zambinella, having recovered himself, once more begged the piece he had so capriciously interrupted, but he sang it badly, and despite all the requests made to him. 251. He refused to sing anything else. Oh, this was the first time he played that capricious tyranny for which he would later be as celebrated as for his talent and his vast fortune, due, as they said, no less to his voice than to his beauty. It is a woman, Sarrasine said, believing himself alone. There is some hidden intrigue here. Cardinal Cicognara is deceiving the Pope and the whole city of Rome. The sculptor thereupon left the salon, gathered his friends together, and posted them out of sight in the courtyard of the Palazzo. When Zambinella was confident that Sarrasine had departed, he appeared to regain his composure. Around midnight, having wandered through the rooms like a man seeking some enemy, the musico departed. As soon as he crossed the threshold of the Palazzo, he was adroitly seized by men who gagged him with a handkerchief and drew him into the carriage Sarrasine had hired. Frozen with horror, Zambinella remained in a corner, not daring to move. He saw before him the terrible face of the artist, who was silent as death. The journey was brief. Carried in Sarrasine's arms, Zambinella soon found himself in a dark, empty studio. Half dead, the singer remained in a chair, without daring to examine the statue of a woman in which he recognized his own features. He made no attempt to speak, but his teeth chattered. Sarrasine paced up and down the room. Suddenly he stopped in front of Zambinella. "Tell me the truth," he pleaded in a low, altered voice. "Why, you are a woman? Oh, Cardinal Cicognara!" Zambinella fell to his knees, and in reply lowered his head. "Ah, you are a woman," the artist cried in a delirium, "for even a..." He broke off. "No," he continued, "he would not be so cowardly." "Ah, do not kill me," cried Zambinella, bursting into tears. "I only agreed to trick you to please my friends, who wanted to laugh." "Laugh?" the sculptor replied in an infernal tone. "Laugh? Laugh low? You dared play with a man's feelings, you? Oh, have mercy." Zambinella replied. 252. "I ought to kill you," Sarrasine cried, drawing his sword with a violent gesture. However, he went on, in cold disdain, "Were I to scour your body with this blade, would I find there one feeling to stifle, one vengeance to satisfy? You are nothing. If you were a man or a woman, I would kill you." But Sarrasine made a gesture of disgust which forced him to turn away, whereupon he saw the statue. "And it's an illusion," he cried. Then, turning to Zambinella, "A woman's heart was a refuge for me, a home. Have you any sisters who resemble you? Then dial, but no, you shall live. Isn't leaving you alive condemning you to something worse than death? It is neither my blood nor my existence that I regret, but the future and my heart's fortune. Why, our feeble hand has destroyed my happiness. What hope can I strip from you for all those you have blighted? You have dragged me down to your level. To love, to be loved, are henceforth meaningless words for me, as they are for you. I shall forever think of this imaginary woman when I see a red woman." He indicated the statue with a gesture of despair. "I shall always have the memory of celestial harpy who thrusts its talons into all my manly feelings, and who will stamp all other women with a seal of imperfection. Monstral you who can give life to nothing. Fot me, you have wiped women from the earth." Sarrasine sat down before the terrified singer. 2 huge tears welled from his dry eyes, rolled down his manly cheeks, and fell to the ground, 2 tears of rage, 2 bitter and burning tears. "No more love. I am dead to all pleasure, to every human emotion." So saying, he seized a hammer and hurled it at the statue with such extraordinary force that he missed it. He thought he had destroyed this monument to his folly, and then took up his sword and brandished it to kill the singer. Zambinella uttered piercing screams. At that moment, 3 men entered, and at once the sculptor fell, stabbed by 3 stiletto thrusts. On behalf of Cardinal Cicognara, one of them said, "It is a good deed worthy of a Christian," replied the French. 253. Man as he died. These sinister messengers informed Zambinella of the concern of his protector, who was waiting at the door in a closed carriage, to take him away, and soon as he had been rescued. "But, Madame de Rochefide asked me, what connection is there between this story and the little old man we saw at the Lantis?" "Madam, Cardinal Cicognara took possession of Zambinella's statue and had it executed in marble. Today it is in the Albany Museum. There, in, the Lanti family found it and asked Vien to copy it. The portrait in which you saw Zambinella at 20, a second after having seen him at 100, later served for Girodet's Endymion, you will have recognized its type in the Adonis. But this Zambinella, he or she? He, madam, is none other than Marianin's great-uncle. Now you can readily see what interest Madame de Lanty has in hiding the source of a fortune which comes from ** enough," she said, gesturing to me imperiously. We sat for a moment plunged in the deepest silence. "Well, I said to her, ah," she exclaimed, standing up and pacing up and down the room. She looked at me and spoke in an altered voice. "Why, oh, you have given me a disgust for life and for passions that will last a long time. Be excepting for monsters, don't all human feelings come down to the same thing, to horrible disappointments? Mothers, our children kill us either by their bad behavior or by their lack of affection. Wives, we are deceived. Mistresses, we are forsaken, abandoned. Does friendship even exist? I would become a nun tomorrow did I not know that I can remain unmoved as a rock amid the storms of life. The Christian's future is also an illusion, at least it is not destroyed until after death. Leave me." "Ah," I said, "you know how to punish. Am I wrong?" "Yes," I replied, with a kind of courage, in telling this story. 254. Which is fairly well known in Italy. I have been able to give you a fine example of the progress made by civilization today. They no longer create these unfortunate creatures. Paris is a very hospitable place," she said, "it accepts everything, shameful fortunes and blood-stained fortunes. Crime and infamy can find asylum here, only virtue has no altars here. Yes, pure souls have their home in heaven. No one will have known me. I am proud of that." And the marquise remained pensive. Paris, November 1830.